The second thing I think we've got to do is we can't just get close. We've got to bring something. We've got to change some of these narratives. You see, we've got all kinds of problems in America. We've made these policy choices. And we make these policy choices, but there's narratives. There are narratives behind the policy choices. We have mass incarceration in this country because we decided to deal with drug addiction and drug dependency as a crime issue rather than a health issue. You see, we could have said that drug addiction, that's a health problem. We need our doctors and our medical providers and our churches to wrap our arms around people who are struggling with addiction. But we didn't say that. We said it's a crime problem, and now we've put hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons. Now with alcoholism, we said, no, that's a health problem. That's a disease. And if we know somebody who's an alcoholic and we see them going to a bar, we would never think, let's call the police. But with drug addiction, we said, no, that's a crime problem. But the reason why we made that choice has to do with a narrative. I believe we've been too often corrupted by what I call the politics of fear and anger. We've got a lot of politicians who want us afraid and they want us angry. And the truth is that when you are afraid and anger, when you allow yourself to be governed in fear and anger, you'll tolerate abuse, you'll tolerate inequality, you'll tolerate injustice. And so we've got to change the narrative. You see, the church is not about fear and anger. The church is about hope and love. And when we represent hope and love, we change the narrative. We've got to change some of these narratives about our children. We had some people going around 40 years ago saying that some children aren't children. They said that these kids may look like kids, they may act like kids. They said, but these are not children. They were mostly talking about black and brown kids. And they said, these kids aren't kids. They came up with a new word. They said, these aren't children. They said, these are, quote, super predators. That's the word they used. And they demonized a generation of children in every state in the country, lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. I have represented 9 and 10-year-old children facing decades in adult prisons. We've got 10,000 children in adult prisons right now. We've condemned 13 and 14-year-old kids to die in prison. And this narrative has to change. I worked on a case some years ago involving a 14-year-old boy. And this boy lived in a household where his mother would sometimes be the target of domestic violence. And one day the boy's mother, she had a boyfriend, and when this man would start drinking, he'd get violent, and the man came home. He'd been drinking, and he went into the kitchen, and he called the boy's mother in there, and he went up to her, and he just punched her in the face. She fell. She hit her head as she fell. She was on the floor bleeding and unconscious. Her son came running in to help his mother. He tried to get her to wake up. He tried to get her to respond, but he couldn't. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. Little boy got up and he went into the bedroom to call the police. And the man was in the bedroom snoring. And the little boy was going to call the police. He was going to get the phone, and then he remembered that the man kept a handgun in his dresser drawer. This child went over to the drawer and he pulled out the gun and he walked over to where the man was sleeping. And he tragically pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, the little boy panicked and he pulled the trigger. He shot the man in the head, killed him almost instantly. Now, this little boy was very small for his age. He was under 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He had a pretty decent school record. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as an adult, but for the fact the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they put him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before his grandmother got me involved, and I went to the jail to see this little boy, and I was stunned at how terrified this child looked when he walked into the visitation room. And he sat down, and I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he just sat there. And I put my pen down. I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. Little boy wouldn't say anything. I got up, and I walked around the table. I put my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. Little boy just staring at the wall. Couldn't figure out what to do, and at some point, I just leaned on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on this little boy, and when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this little boy started to cry, and through his tears began talking to me, not about what happened with the man, not about what happened with his mom, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been sexually assaulted by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been, and I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I finally got him calm. I said, look, you stay right here. I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And I will never forget that little boy grabbing me by the arm saying, please, please don't go. Please don't go. I said, no, it's okay. It's all right. We're going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And when I left that jail, the question I had in my mind is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We've allowed these narratives to emerge about some of our children. We've begun to think that some children aren't children. We've started throwing away children, and I believe the scriptures remind us and require us to recognize that all of God's children are children, that we cannot begin throwing away the children that are struggling. You see, I don't think we're going to be judged by how we treat specially talented children, the privileged children, the gifted children. You see, I think we're going to be judged by how we deal with the children that are dealing with trauma and poverty and abuse and neglect. That's where we show our love of the future. And we've got to change these narratives about what it means to stand with children suffering. We've got to change the narratives about poverty in this country. You see, I think we've got some problems that we've got to deal with. We've got a criminal justice system in this country that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And I believe God wants us to speak to that. God is about justice. I think we've got to talk about the problems of race. I mean, it's a hard thing to talk about, but the truth is we're not really free, and there are these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt that get assigned to certain kinds of people, and we've got to talk about this. We've got to change the narrative about race. You see, I don't think that the great evil of our history has been addressed. I think we're burdened by this history of racial inequality. It's like smog in the air. And even in the church, sometimes you see it manifesting itself. And I think we've got to talk about some things we haven't talked about. You see, we're living in a post-genocide society. You see, in this country, there was a genocide. Before white settlers came, there were native people here. And we killed that community. We rounded them up. We made them leave. And we haven't talked about it. We haven't done the things you're supposed to do. And that narrative of racial difference that was crafted during that era, you see, I think that was the true evil of American slavery. I don't think the great evil of slavery in America was involuntary servitude and forced labor. I believe the great evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference, this ideology we created that some people aren't good like other people. And you see that narrative of racial difference, that was the true evil. We said, oh no, these black people are different. They can't do this, they can't do that, they're not this, that, not that. And that narrative, that was the true evil. And if you read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't talk about narratives of racial difference. It talks about involuntary servitude. It talks about forced labor. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. You see, whereas there was this period of time, you know, we're not just in a slave state, we're in a lynching state. We had lynchings and terrorism all throughout this country. And it left these wounds that we've got to address. You see, older people come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We don't worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced. And that story is something we've got to address. You see, the black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi, exiles from lynching. And then we had this heroic civil rights movement, and I think it's wonderful, but we haven't dealt with all the injuries. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives. They'd see those signs that said white and colored. They weren't directions, they were assaults, and we've got to address those injuries. And today, because we didn't do it, there's a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. Not everybody who ends up in jail or prison has done something wrong. Some people just are in this place where they're presumed dangerous and guilty, and we've got to change the narrative. I believe it. I was in court not too long ago. I had my suit and tie on. I was sitting at defense counsel's table. I was ready to do this hearing. And the judge walked in and he looked at me and he said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. I don't want any defendants sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. I said, my name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. And then my client came in, a young white kid I was representing, and we did this hearing. But afterward, I was thinking, what is it when this judge saw a middle-aged black man in a suit and tie? It didn't even occur to him that's the lawyer. What that is this narrative of racial difference, and we've got to change the narrative. We do. In South Africa, you can't go there without learning about apartheid. If you go to Rwanda, they're going to make you understand the difficulties created by the genocide. If you go to Germany today, there are markers and monuments to reflect on the homes where Jewish families were abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial, but in America, we're not talking about slavery. We're not talking about lynching. We're not talking about segregation. And we've got to change that. And I believe God calls us to be voices for justice, because until we eliminate this narrative of racial difference, we're going to see inequality.